Hey, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we talk about a significant event that I like to call the biggest economic experiment in history. And of course, I'm talking about the 2008 financial crisis, the Great Recession, whatever you'd like to call it. But more importantly, what I want to do is explain why this event was such a big turning point for global economics, and why it was the beginning of the end for globalization as we know it. So let's start off with a little historical context here. For the past several decades, if not the past century, we've seen an incredible amount of global economic integration. This process, which I'll refer to as globalization, has brought tremendous benefits to billions of people around the world, particularly in emerging markets. As countries like China and India developed, hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty and into a middle-class lifestyle. Globalization has also resulted in greater cultural and political cooperation between nations. We've gone from a world where countries were constantly at war with one another to a world where countries were increasingly dependent on one another for trade and investment. This process has been so powerful that it's caused many to believe that war and conflict between nations is no longer possible. However, all of that came crashing down in 2008 when the global economy fell into the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The culprit, the United States. At the time, the U.S. was in the midst of a housing bubble. For nearly 2 decades prior, investors had been pouring money into the U.S. housing market, driving prices to unsustainable levels. When the bubble finally burst, it sent shockwaves throughout the entire global economy. The U.S. was the epicenter of the crisis, but no country was spared. European banks were heavily invested in the U.S. housing market, and they suffered massive losses when prices collapsed. Emerging market economies that relied on trade with the U.S. and Europe saw their exports plummet and their currencies collapse. By the end of 2008, every single country on Earth was in recession, while the world was able to muddle through and eventually recover. The 2008 financial crisis was a watershed moment that marked the beginning of the end for globalization. You see, prior to 2008, emerging market investors were incredibly optimistic about the future of globalization. They believed that the trend of global economic integration would continue, and that their countries would continue to grow rapidly. However, the 2008 financial crisis shattered that optimism. Emerging market investors realized that globalization was not as invincible as they had thought, and that their countries were still vulnerable to external shocks. As a result, they began to pull their money out of emerging markets and invested in safer assets like gold and real estate. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, we have not seen a single emerging market country outperform the S&P 500 over the past decade. All right, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.